Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Tom Garditz, the Director of the Office for Human Dignity, and welcome to our program this evening. In his latest encyclical, Fratelii, Tutti, Pope Francis lays out a vision for a post-pandemic world. We cannot return to normal because normal wasn't working. Rather, we must find a new way forward, a way that calls for individual and collective conversion, a way that seeks a communal approach to the burning issues of our day, such as poverty, immigration, racism, war, the dignity of women, the right to life, international relations, liberty, and other issues. Encyclicals are letters sent by popes to the faithful the world over, speaking to issues of the day. Very often, not only Catholics, but Christians of other traditions, as well as people of different faiths, and those with no stated faith at all, have interest in these letters. This encyclical draws from the words of his namesake, St. Francis, and calls us to live in the realization that we are Fratelli Tutti, that is, all brothers. We can say all sisters and brothers. This evening, the ministry team of the Office for Human Dignity is going to unpack this encyclical and share how it influences the work of our various ministries. I'm going to now allow each member of the team to introduce themselves. I'd ask everybody that's joined us to mute their mics, and we will begin with introductions.
Hello, my name is Brian Hickey, and I'm the Associate Director of our Justice and Peace Ministry.
Hello there, my name is Alex Quesada, and I serve in the Diocese of Joliet as the Relief and Development Coordinator, and I'm very happy to be here today.
Hello, I'm Bruce Carlson, the Missions Coordinator for the Diocese. I help organize our missions and send them on their way.
I am Sister Nancy Schramm, a Franciscan Sister of the Sacred Heart, and I work together with Bruce as the Formation Director for Missions.
Hi, I'm Felicia Rodriguez. I am the Missions Assistant. I work with Bruce.
My name is Alexandra Curator, and I serve in Respect Life Ministry and Ministry to and with persons with disabilities.
Hi, I'm Mary Dragavon. I'm the Administrative Assistant for the Office for Human Dignity.
I'm Pam Letty, and I'm an associate with the Joliet Franciscans and a member of Sacred Heart Parish in Joliet.
Hi everyone, my name is Kayla Jacobs and I'm the Director of Programs for Laudato Si Ministries for the Office for Human Dignity of the Diocese of Joliet.
Hi everyone, I'm Mia White from Jordan River Farm and we are in Pembroke Township, Illinois.
Thank you, each of you. We're going to pray now together an ecumenical Christian prayer that is part of the Fratelli Tutti encyclical. And so I ask for you to, again, if everyone would mute their mics and pray along with me, if you would. O God, Trinity of love, from the profound communion of your divine life, pour out upon us a torrent of fraternal love. Grant us the love reflected in the actions of Jesus, in his family of Nazareth, and in the early Christian community. Grant that we Christians may live the gospel, discovering Christ in each human being, recognizing him crucified in the sufferings of the abandoned and forgotten of our world, and risen in each brother or sister who makes a new start. Come, Holy Spirit, show us your beauty, reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important and all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity that God so loves. Amen. We're going to begin now with questions on the encyclical. I'll be directing them to the different members of the ministry team, but I invite you as well in the chat feature, if you have questions that you would like different members of the ministry team to answer, to put that in the chat box, and at the towards the end of our program, we'll try to take a few of those questions. And so let us begin with the introduction to Fratelli Tutti. St. Francis, Pope Francis' namesake, obviously has a significant influence on the Pope and on this encyclical. He also guided the Pope's previous encyclical, Laudato Si. Kayla, can you help us recall Laudato Si and the link between the ecological and social crisis described in the two encyclicals?
Yeah, so a classic line in Laudato Si is hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. That's generally the summary of that encyclical. And it really highlights that the two crises, so like social crises and ecological crises, are inseparable. So every social issue is made worse by the climate crisis, and the climate crisis is made worse by other social issues. So Pope Francis outlines this in both of the encyclicals in a very integral and holistic way. And it's also the way we try to run our ministry, and that is to protect life and all that sustains life.
Thank you, Kayla. Sister Nancy, you are a Franciscan sister. Can you share the influence St. Francis has on your congregation, and more specifically, perhaps, on the mission work that you've been involved with almost your entire adult life?
Yes, thank you, Tom. The key word for Franciscan spirituality is relationship. And Francis was very much impressed by and profoundly deepened his own understanding of the great mystery of the Incarnation. The Incarnation being so important in his life because it showed that God sent his only Son, God so loved the world, to enter into relationship with us just as a human person, to become indeed brother for us. And so this incarnation, this appearance of Jesus as our brother, opens us up to all kinds of relationships. When Francis would say, brother sun and sister moon and brother fire, and it wasn't this pietistic language that he was using. It was indeed a very deep knowledge that all of creation, all living things, all created things were indeed our sisters and our brothers. That has profoundly influenced me in my very early missionary days when I just first went to Brazil, where I spent many years, because it was building those relationships with the people that surrounded us that I could learn what it meant to love God. You know, when I was young, I went there thinking I was going to teach everybody, but everybody taught me. And now in the mission office, as the director of mission formation, we base our mission trips on that same premise. It's building relationships. We do service, yes, we do service medically, construction, outreach, but that's not as important as the relationships that we build when we are in mission and when we are next to God's people.
Thank you, Nancy. Pope Francis laments individualistic culture and a country's lack of respect for cultures in the first chapter of this letter. Why does our society insist on a more and more individualistic culture? How do you respect the culture of those with whom you partner in missions? Bruce?
What I would like to do to answer the question is to share a personal story that might help us focus on the idea of the culture. My mother was born in Sweden, came to the United States in 1937. My father's parents were also from Sweden. They came to the United States right around 1900. Shortly after World War II, my father was with some friends at a local tavern having something to eat and drink. And my dad decided that he would say something to one of the waitresses in Swedish. Little did he know he would get an answer back in Swedish. And that started a great love story. My parents got married, my sister and I came along. But the one thing we never learned was the Swedish culture. The idea was, it was only America. You were Americans, you didn't need to know anything else. So we grew up, well, we must have the way of doing everything. We didn't know exactly what the rest of the world was about. Then as I got into missions, we started to go to different places, and imagine our first construction site that we went to, and they said, well, we need to mix cement. And they pointed to the ground, and we said, there's no way you can mix cement without a cement mixer, or at least having a cement box to mix it in. So we learned right away that we didn't have all the answers. And this is what I see the Pope's encyclical is about, is trying to say we need to be able to listen to each other. We need to share with each culture and try to develop answers and solutions to the problems that we have. In doing that, we will be able to learn from each other and have a world that is much more open and become more of a family.
Pope Francis also highlights the throwaway culture in this chapter, highlighting the unborn and the elderly. Alexandra, the name of your ministry, Respect Life, speaks for itself. What does Pope Francis have to say regarding the unborn and elderly, and do we see this problem locally?
Yes, thank you, Tom. So Pope Francis does speak about the throwaway world, and he says that it stands in direct opposition to this building of fraternity, which we're hoping to work on. He talks about how persons are no longer loved, cherished, and respected as they should be. He specifically focuses on the unborn, who he says are deemed not yet useful, as well as the elderly, who are deemed no longer needed. And he even addresses both the decline in the birth rate as well as the relegation of the elderly to a sad and lonely existence as two examples of how we have only focused on ourselves rather than building a fraternal network with one another. Unfortunately, we do see these problems here locally. Before I explain how, I do want to note just that if you or someone you know is suffering after an abortion, that hope and help are available through Project Rachel Ministry. One can find help and hope and healing through hopeafterabortion.com. With that being said, tragically here in our local area, we have 3 abortion clinics where children are tragically killed regularly and their bodies are literally thrown away as medical waste. So they very much are victims of this throwaway culture that Pope Francis speaks of in the encyclical. Furthermore, when we look at the elderly, one only needs to have a conversation with a handful of elderly in our community to know that many of them feel that they are no longer loved or needed, both by their families and by the culture as a whole. So unfortunately, those 2 examples show us that we have a lot of work to do in this area so that we can truly become brothers and sisters that love one another.
Thank you, Alexandra. Chapter 1 also connects throwaway culture to reducing human cost in the workforce and our global lack of support for migrants and refugees. Brian, how can our culture shift from a productivity or usefulness mindset to a primary focus on human dignity?
Thank you, Tom. Well, a cultural shift is certainly not easy because it often goes against our instincts. We are accustomed, or at least I know I am, to trying to be more efficient and get the most out of our activity or time in the day. And unfortunately, that mindset seeps into how we view society or how we judge another human being because of a perceived lack of productivity. So a cultural shift would seem to require a reconfiguration of our business and institutions to assess the end goal of a productivity or output. Here we can even look to the church's long support of labor rights as supporting the worker, not necessarily always the end. And we also know from Catholic social teaching that the end goal should be a prioritization of the flourishing of human beings. So then some hard questions for a business, for example, can arise, such as, what does a business do when an employee cannot perform his or her duties to improve output because of unexpected occurrences, like caring for a sick loved one or a possible planned circumstance, such as pregnancy? And also, how can our society support businesses who provide for employees who are not immediately productive? Those are questions we should be asking. We must also look at Pope Francis's later comments in the encyclical about business as a vocation for supporting people's livelihoods. Catholic social teaching should not be considered antagonistic to business, but more supportive in how we can foster the good of their employees and society. We can look at many positive examples in our society, both at home and abroad. We also need to look at our society's general culture too. How do we want to support those who cannot make an immediate impact on our country's financial output? We can also ask similar questions of accompanied people in our society, like we have highlighted, the unborn, the elderly, and those in prisons. It's hard, and as Pope Francis said, we say one thing with words, but our decisions and reality tell another story.
Thank you, Brian. Moving on to chapter 2. Alex, could you comment on Pope Francis' use of the parable and share how the Catholic Campaign for Human Development's mission and our diocesan partner organizations live out this parable?
I will be very happy to do that, Tom. Thank you for the opportunity. I want to make sure that I mention something that you may already know. The Catholic Campaign for Human Development is the national anti-poverty program of the U.S. Catholic bishops, working to carry out the mission of Jesus Christ, helping the poor. And then here at the Diocese of Joliet, we are tremendously blessed in many ways. Through CCHD, we have a healthy relationship with multiple organizations in our area. For the sake of time, I cannot mention all of them, but I'm going to give you a sample of them. This non-for-profit organization, We Grow Dreams. This organization provides job training and employment opportunities for people with mental and physical disabilities. At this point, I would like to mention here that Pope Francis shifts our attention to the gospel, to the very well-known parable of the Good Samaritans. He challenges us to take a look to each one of the characters and brings the reflection of where are we on this parable? Where do we position ourselves? With the robber, with the priest, with the Levi, with the innkeeper? So I ask myself, and my answer is, no one wants to be the robber. However, we have plenty of occasions where, due to the fear to the robber, indirectly, we help the robber when we become just as spectators and do nothing about it. So the bottom line to me is, will we bend down and touch the wounds and heal others? Will we bend down and help others to get up? That's my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. We're trying to be conscious of time here, and I know some of us are preachers and would like to get going, and Alex is one of them, but we will move on. Thank you, Alex. Moving on to chapter 3. The Catholic social teaching themes of the common good and solidarity are highlighted in chapter 3. Kayla, why are these themes integral to Laudato Si Ministries?
Yeah, so the climate crisis, which is what Laudato Si Ministries is focused on, is a unique issue in the sense that nobody is spared of it. All of us experience it. All of us are affected by it. But that being said, the poor and the vulnerable are the most affected by the climate crisis. And for that reason, solidarity is one of our primary tenets of our ministry. Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti defines solidarity as thinking and acting in terms of community. And that's essentially what our whole ministry is based off of. Actually, that's really what our whole Office for Human Dignity ministry is based off of, but including Laudato Si. And so a couple ways in which we do this in Laudato Si ministries is, well, a lot of ways, but I'm going to highlight 3. So one is our environmental justice work. So working with poor and vulnerable communities and protecting them specifically around air quality and water issues. Like clean water issues. Another is our food program. So Jordan River Farm is an example of that, as well as other community gardens. So growing food for people who are hungry in food desert areas and people who can't afford food, healthy organic food otherwise. And then another way in which we do this, and Pope Francis actually uses this as an example in Fratelli Tutti, is conservation. So living with it, or living really in a way in which we're not overusing resources, even though we might have like unlimited access to clean water, but choosing to conserve water for the sake of people who don't have that same access. So those are just a few ways in which we live out solidarity in Laudato Si ministry.
Thank you, Kayla. In chapter 3, Pope Francis writes, perhaps controversially, about private property. Brian, can you speak about the common good in relation to how he refers to private property?
Yes, Tom. The question of private property certainly grabbed the headlines from the encyclical, but it's actually nothing new in papal encyclicals. And here, Pope Francis follows Catholic social tradition that has been elucidated by previous popes in other encyclicals. So no, Pope Francis is not advocating for the abolition of private property. He's actually articulating what is known as the universal destination of goods in Catholic social teaching. And the universal destination of goods affirms God's lordship, if you will, over all things. And therefore, all the goods that God created are destined for all of humankind's use. Or put another way, all of God's creation is for the common good of all humanity. And private property is a right, and private property is good for humans' freedom, but that does not mean private property is a right that should supersede all other rights. Our Justice and Peace leaders, for example, discussed Rerum Novarum last week. Rerum Novarum is the first of modern papal social encyclicals that address the theological understanding of private property. We discussed the demands of Christianity that Christ calls us to seek the good and well-being of others. So practically what I think Pope Francis is writing about private property follows the practice that we, followers of Christ, have a duty to give to those in need once our own necessities are taken care of.
Thank you, Brian. Pope Francis writes about hidden exiles in our midst. Alexandra, can you discuss what this means for persons with disabilities and the elderly and what our response can be?
Yes, thank you. So Pope Francis lists both the elderly and persons with disabilities as hidden exiles, people that are treated as foreign bodies within society, is the way he frames that. And regarding persons with disabilities, he says many people with disabilities feel as though they exist, without participating. And he calls us to respond by finding ways to ensure that all persons with disabilities find ways to be active participants in both the civil and ecclesial communities at all times. And regarding the elderly, which is another example of a hidden exile here in our midst, those that feel that they are pushed onto the periphery, he says sometimes in society they are considered to be a burden. Tragically, that's how they're viewed often. And he says that that's a complete tragedy because each elderly person has a unique contribution to the common good. And so we need to keep that in mind as we cherish the elderly. And his whole initiative, he tries to encourage us to have a response that gives a voice to each and every person that's discriminated against, especially due to age or disability. And his whole hope, he says, is that we can acknowledge that all persons have an equal dignity. And when we do that, that will transform things so that we no longer have hidden exiles, but rather we live as brothers and sisters.
Thank you. In chapter 4, Pope Francis writes about learning from other cultures and promoting integral human development. I'm going to direct this question to several of you, first to Nia, then to Bruce and Brian. But here's the question. What does integral human development mean for your ministries? Nia?
You're muted, Nia.
Okay, let's move on to Bruce and come back to Nia then. Bruce, could you answer that question? What does integral human development mean for your ministry?
I think from the point of view here, we're looking for how to come together as people. The one great thing that we've been able to do with mission is to learn to go to a mission site and be open to what the culture has to offer us, to what the people have to say, how they do things. Even though, as I said earlier, we mix cement one way in the United States and expect it to be done that way, we had to learn to go with the ways that the people there did things. And it allowed us then to build a relationship with those folks. So at the end of a working day, we could sit down and start to share our stories about ourselves with each other and build that relationship that they started to trust us. And depending on the mission site that we went to, it would allow us to develop a relationship that we eventually could start to change ideas back and forth. They trusted us enough to believe that we weren't there to try and overwhelm them. We were curious about how they do things, and they were willing to start to listen to what we had. And a great example was how to tie down roofing trusses to the houses. We talked about a way here that we use for protection from roofing and hurricanes. And when they realized what we were saying, they said, well, we've never thought of that idea before. And they started using that technique in their construction so that when their typhoons and things came through, their houses were better built. They were more able to withstand the winds and things like that. So it's in this common action of working together and sharing ideas and building trust, we are able to move ahead and share in our ideas and get a little more work done in that way.
Thank you. Nia, do we have you?
Yes. So our ministry, Jordan River Farm, is a sustainable garden, farm, and retreat center. And our mission and vision, myself as a citizen of Pembroke Township now, when it comes to human developments and everything we do, every service, every project that we have, we want it to be a benefit and help the good of the people of Pembroke Township. So that means being an advocate, sharing knowledge pertaining to green and ecological living, how to do it, how they can best do it in their homes, how they can share, and how we do our ministry here. But most importantly, we would love to serve the community in a dignified way. So, for example, like if everyone here is allergic to broccoli, we don't want to grow broccoli because nobody's going to use it. So when we have different programs, you want people to come. We don't want to just give people what we grow or what we do. We want them to come and actually work to earn that, have a self-worth. We don't want to just give away and just feel like we're just giving to people in the area, like here's free stuff. We want it to be dignified on both ends. So that's how Jordan River Farm, in short, does human development.
Thanks, Nia. Brian?
Yes, thank you. For justice and peace, integral human development takes on a variety of forms, as the term itself implies. And I'll briefly touch on integral human development's founding and vision to explain how we might think about it. So integral human development was first articulated as a measure of development for how resource-rich countries should seek to interact with countries of fewer resources. Pope Paul VI put forth a vision of development to focus on more than a place's, or even we could say an individual's economic prosperity. So instead of focusing on economic prosperity, we rather focus on all the other aspects with financial flourishing, including family life, literacy, and intellectual life, and religion. So integral human development for justice and peace consists of seeking the conditions that allow for an individual's flourishing, not only having the necessities such as water, food, and shelter, but also pathways for individuals to receive an education, to freely seek and practice their faith, or to feel secure from any outside harm or violence. Integral human development also insists on empowering individuals, as Nia and Bruce touched on, to shape their own lives and development. So I'll finish with a quick example that might articulate this concept that Bruce also touched on. A few years ago, I lived in Djibouti, a small country in the Horn of Africa, and worked mainly with migrant and refugee youth who live on the streets. They're from the surrounding countries of Djibouti. Two of the most valuable objects at our center, where we welcome these migrants and refugees, were a soccer ball and large music speakers. Of course, we served food and had showers for the kids, but those in itself were insufficient for any sort of development. Our youth clung to opportunities to play soccer together or dance to music together, and I did too. So in closing, integral human development for us seeks flourishing for all humans in every aspect of life, with the necessities to survive, but also those things that make life worth living too.
Thanks, Brian. Chapters 5 and 6 provide direction for a better kind of politics and encourage dialogue and friendship in society. I'm going to direct this to 4 members of the team. Here's the question. How can we embody a culture of dialogue and encounter to effectively share our message of human dignity for all? Alexandra, if you'd go first on this.
Yeah, so one of the things that Pope Francis says on that question that really stood out to me in the encyclical was instructing everyone in order to build this culture of dialogue to have a tender love for others. I thought that was really powerful, a tender love for others. And he said it's a love that necessitates that we draw near to one another, which is where that encounter piece comes in. It's drawing near to one another so that we can have this tender love. And he talks about how amidst all the daily concerns of life and of politics, that the smallest, the weakest, the poorest have to have a daily pull on our hearts because they are our brothers and sisters. And so I think that's really the foundational piece. If we can have this tender love for others and allow our hearts to be pulled and inclined towards others, so that we can enter into a culture of dialogue and find a better way forward.
Thank you. Let me go back to Brian.
Yes, I thought Pope Francis wrote well to help explain to how our discussions on various issues often quickly turn into viewing everything through a political ideology. And this, of course, goes across our current American political spectrum, as, of course, neither of our two main political parties fully embody Catholic social teaching. I think one way to practice this vision that Pope Francis articulates is to speak about issues in a way that we can also explain our vision for individual and collective human flourishing that comes in light of scripture and Catholic tradition, from what we've touched upon already. I don't think it's enough in our political climate to simply state support for issues. We have to explain why we believe in particular policies in support of, or in light of Catholic social tradition and scripture. For example, why we believe in the moral responsibility to increase our intake of refugees, or how and why taking a vaccine contributes to the common good, or why religious freedom is necessary in a healthy society. So our ability to share this vision with others and build a culture that respects all human dignity must first start with listening to understand where people's ideas for human flourishing might come from, their concerns for themselves, their family, their community, but also their fears and hopes for the future. And I think we can only make progress in sharing our vision for human dignity when we go outside of our own circles of those who are likely to agree with us on particular issues, and find those whose vision for what human dignity, that differs from our understanding of God's plan. We can then find common ground and share why we believe in our vision on human dignity, for which we might disagree. And I'll just briefly say, I thought Pope Francis practiced this well in his recent visit to Iraq, where he met with Ayatollah al-Sistani, who is one of the most influential Muslim clerics for Shia Muslims. And here they obviously have disagreements in their personal religion, but they're also very influential religious figures, and they were able to come together and discuss what they do agree on. And we're all excited to see what that progress is going to look like in the future.
Very good. Kayla.
All right. So the chapter on a better type of politics really resonated with me when I first read it, because sometimes I just get really bummed out by our political culture in the world. So it's really refreshing to hear from the Pope on this issue, and very specifically of what Alexandra said, and a tender-hearted approach to politics, which is a very different type of politics than what we've all been experiencing in recent times, or maybe ever. But anyway, so Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti talks about that the whole purpose of politics is for societal charity, and is to serve the common good. And so he kind of gives some principles of what that could look like. So it's communal and not based on individualistic and betterment, but the betterment of the whole community. It's not short-sighted. It tackles issues at the core and not just putting band-aids on everything. And then he also calls for politicians to care less about polls, but more about serving the community. And it was just really refreshing to hear those words from our Pope. And he also notes several times in these chapters that it sounds impossible, especially during these times. It sounds like an ideal or like a utopia, but he encourages us to have hope and to really work towards a better type of politics and dialogue. And the way to get there is to have tender hearts and to have dialogue with people who don't necessarily agree with us.
Thanks, Kayla. Nancy.
Yes, one of the important words that Pope Francis uses here, and he uses in many of his writings, comes from his Latin American background. A very, very strong word in liberation theology is encounter. Encounter is not just passing by someone, but it means to enter again into those deep relationships. And one of the things he talks about is the intentional use of processes of encounter. We have to be able to create moments and educational platforms and venues so that we can really teach respect and openness and recognize diversity, to appreciate the other gifts that everybody has. And instead of questioning why you do things, I've learned a long time ago that to be curious to what is different is a very important attitude. Curiosity allows you then to listen and not to judge when things are being done differently. We need to let go of arrogance. We need to show our children, when our young people, people who do not have exposure to different cultures, that this is the way that we can build these bridges. As Bruce mentioned before in the other question, on mission, we don't go out and say, well, in America, we do this. On mission, we listen, we encounter, we ask why, we are curious, but then we do according to what that culture is asking or is telling us is better. And the beauty of the diverse gifts is something that I have learned many, many times over and over again. Right when I think that I have seen the best of people and the best of way of doing things, people come, their cultures, their languages, the way they dress and the way they look and talk. It's just amazing. It's all a gift from God. And I think that those qualities those characteristics in people are very important so that we can truly be sisters and brothers.
Beautifully said, Nancy. Thank you. Chapter 7 explores paths of renewed encounter, putting an emphasis on finding friendships with the poor. It also speaks to the need of building pathways, structures that promote peace, the preferential option for nonviolence. Brian, what should we make of Pope Francis' writing on humanitarian intervention in this chapter?
Tom, I will need about an hour to answer that question, but I'll try my best briefly. This is undoubtedly a complicated question, but it must be engaged, especially in our country, because of our ability to intervene and affect outcomes anywhere in the world. I'll start with acknowledging Pope Francis' continued lamentation in this chapter of using common phrases that are now overused or have lost its meaning in order for people to justify war. He writes that it is now difficult to invoke the rational criteria articulated in previous centuries to speak of just war. I think we can also connect the emphasis on the concept of dialogue and encounter in this respect with advocacy for what is called preventative diplomacy. Preventative diplomacy is a concept that, especially in our interconnected world and ability to communicate quickly, avenues for communication or dialogue must always be open and continuous. If we are always in constant communication and dialogue with other countries' leaders, then we can better prevent violence or limit widespread war. Of course, this is easier said than done, but it is a crucial process to implement. Now, the question on humanitarian intervention can be considered a bit different than simply invoking war. For instance, the Vatican and USCCB's opposition to the US invasion of Iraq in 2002 was not considered humanitarian intervention. However, the NATO-led coalition with a heavy US presence that intervened in Libya in 2011 could be considered a humanitarian intervention because the coalition sought to enact the United Nations doctrine known as responsibility to protect. The Church has expressed support in the past for responsibility to protect that allows for intervention, possibly armed, to protect unarmed civilians. A similar cause can be cited for military intervention against the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. So in conclusion, I don't see Pope Francis excluding intervention based on situations like Libya or the Islamic State, but it does clearly lay out a case for preferential option for nonviolence in all situations. So let us continue to focus on preventing conditions that lead to violence and seeking dialogue and encounter from citizens to government officials.
Thank you, Brian. We're nearing a close. We still have one more chapter to go over, but I want to remind our listeners this evening, if you have any questions for the team, just put that in the chat box and we'll try to pick up a couple of those. Chapter 8. Pope Francis finishes the encyclical by declaring that the church cannot and should not sit on the sidelines in the building of a better world. What is your recommendation to anyone looking to get off the sidelines and into action? Kayla, let's start with you on that.
Okie dokie. So the method that we use in our ministry is see, judge, act, celebrate, and repeat. So you see an issue, and I recommend the best way to see an issue is to be with the poor and the vulnerable. So, I mean, right now we're during a pandemic, so that might be a little different, but in other times, you know, be with the poor and the vulnerable, go on mission if you can, volunteer locally at a pantry or a homeless shelter, encounter people who are in vulnerable situations, and by seeing those situations, reflect on it, which is the judging part. So what does the church say about these issues? Form your own conscience and how you want to respond to these issues. And then the next step is to act upon it. So decide what you want to do. And there are a lot of opportunities to act upon it within our Office for Human Dignity. So you could always reach out to any of us if you want to get involved in that way. But then also make sure that you celebrate your wins. If you advocate for a piece of legislation and it passes, make sure you celebrate that. If you help somebody or you make somebody's day better who's in a vulnerable situation, celebrate that as well. And then the last step is to repeat that process because there are always issues in the world and people who need help. And so it's not just a one and done type of thing. It's something that you have to keep doing as a Christian for the rest of our lives. And then another thing, a way to get off the sidelines is just implement these things, like build these daily habits in your everyday life. So I use the example of conserving water. Julian would like this one, go a day without meat, or just live more simply in solidarity with people who are in poor and vulnerable situations.
Great. Bruce?
Well, I'm going to follow off on Kayla's idea and say that if you really want to put this encyclical into practice, come join us on mission. We've been really, everything that we've talked about tonight is one way or another part of our mission program, even though it isn't in a written format as we've talked about here. We go and do these type of things. We interact with the people. We go to them openly and say, tell us about yourself. What is your culture like? How do you do things? And in doing that, we create, again, as I said before, that idea of relationship. And in doing that, it makes this such more a global idea. In fact, if you really think about it, it's almost Trinitarian in what we're trying to do. Instead of just saying, we have the way to do something and think that that's the only way, and make it a dualistic idea, going to other people and hearing how they do things and get their input gives you an insight into how you may want to accomplish things yourself. We see that in many missioners, as they come back from mission, they go, my whole world looks different right now. I don't see things in the way I saw it before. By going to this other country, to this other culture, they open my eyes, they open my heart to see how the things can be accomplished, how we can work together as a people and become that one family that the Pope is talking about. We all have different ideas and different thoughts, but it's in ability to exchange those ideas and those thoughts is what we get the chance to do on mission. And we have a great time. We learn about it. We laugh with the people. We are able to achieve the great goal of bringing ourselves together and sharing our faith. And to me, as a deacon, that's promoting the gospel message to each other. By doing that, I think we're doing what Jesus asked us to do and reaching out to the rest of the world.
Thanks, Bruce. Brian, back to you again.
Well, to go off what Kayla and Bruce just talked about, I think there are so many different subjects, issues for which we advocate and work on. I think anyone can easily get started. So we can simply start by prayerfully discerning on what to get involved in, and then start simply by seeking out others who are already working on the issues. For our Justice and Peace community, we have been discussing various people, social encyclicals, and just discussing those issues together inevitably brings up different ways that we can put it into action. And Kayla briefly mentioned, or she gave us the definition of See, Judge, Act. And I'll just give a quick example of one thing that we've been working on in the Justice and Peace Ministry. So there's new legislation called the Family Security Act that basically gives out a child allowance for parents who have children. So in thinking about this legislation, we see that child poverty is a massive problem, unfortunately still in the United States. And working as a parent is very hard. And even being at home as a parent is, of course, very hard. So we see that those are very big issues. And then we judge by looking at this legislation, and this legislation is proposed to cut deep child poverty by half, and child poverty in general by a quarter. And it also give parents more time with their kids, which is something that we want as Catholics. So then in acting, we send letters to our legislators and advocate on that issue. So that's just one small example on See, Judge, Act. I'll close by saying that we must get in the arena, not least because Jesus told us to do so, but also because, as Pope Francis wrote, and as Bruce just said, well, if we aren't encountering others and sharing what it means to respect human dignity at all times and all stages and in all situations, then another ideology or opinion that does not acknowledge our transcendent truth will take over and deny the fundamental dignity of every human and create the image and likeness of God. And that's not a society we want to live in.
Thanks, Brian. Alexandra.
Yes, so I would echo most of what has already been said, and definitely encouraging everyone to always, including myself, to pray and ask the Lord how He's asking each of us to grow in love for Him and for others on a constant basis, so that we can further love Him and others and use that as our springboard for action. In Respect Life Ministry, we serve in the areas of prayer, pastoral care, education, and advocacy. If you're interested or feel a little tug in one of those directions, don't hesitate to give me a call, and I'd love to discern with you. We have different things that we already have in place that we work on, but perhaps the Holy Spirit's calling you to something new as well, not only for Respect Life Ministry, but perhaps ministry too with persons with disabilities or any of the other wonderful ministries in our office. So we just encourage you to pray and ask the Holy Spirit to guide you, and we'd love to talk with you to see where that might lead.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. This has been a very rich program. I hope that you all have learned as much as I have. Up until 5 minutes before this started, I thought Fratelli Tutti was the latest flavor of gelato, of the new gelato, but I found out it is quite flavorful and quite good, but not gelato. So anyway, thank you all for being with us this evening. If you have any questions going forward, feel free to reach out to us, pick up the phone, send us an email, message us on Facebook. We're just delighted that we had the opportunity to spend an hour with you this evening. And so let us now go in the love of God to learn what it means to be brothers and sisters, all of us together. Good night, everybody.